Good morning and welcome to the live BSI Cybersecurity and Aerospace webinar, Beyond the Cloud, Securing the Future of Aerospace. I'll just give people a few more minutes to join before I begin. Okay, I am Francesca Bailey and I'm here today to help facilitate the webinar. Before we start, I just want to make you aware that you've joined this webinar in a mute-only mode, so you cannot talk to each other or to us as there's quite a few of you in the line today. However, please feel free to type your questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel, and we'll do our best to answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We will also run polls during the course of the webinar to engage with you and gain your feedback. If for any reason you're unable to vote on any of our polls, please come out of the full screen viewing mode, and this should help resolve the issue. At the very end of the webinar, we will run a survey to ask you what you thought of the webinar today. I'd also like to point out that we're running this webinar remotely from our homes, so although we hope this won't be the case, if there are any technical hitches, background disruption, please do accept our apologies and bear with us. With me today are our guest speakers. We have Brendan Hill, Global Head of Aerospace at BSI, Mark Brown, Global Managing Director of Cybersecurity and Information Resilience at BSI, and Willie Fabricius, Global Head of Information Security and Business Continuity at BSI. So without further ado, I'll now pass over to Mark to kickstart the introductions.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Mark Brown, and as Fran mentioned, I'm the Global Managing Director for Cybersecurity Information Resilience at BSI, leading our consulting services perspective today. I have a background of almost 30 years across cybersecurity in various different sectors, and post introductions today will be facilitating and hosting the webinar and the chat with the other panelists. Over to you, Brendan.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. My name's Brendan Hill, Global Head of Aerospace at BSI. I've been in aerospace for 40 odd years. Yes, I am that old, including 26 years in the military, working on a variety of rotary wing aircraft, including on operations. On the quality management side of things, I wrote and implemented the quality management system for the technical support of all British Army systems. So aerospace and management systems is my background. Over to you, Willie.
Yeah, good evening, good morning, and live from Chicago. My name is Willie Fabricius. I'm the Global Head for Information Security and Business Continuity at BSI. I'm in the management system domain for the last 25, 26 years, and in third-party assessments to various international standards for the last 24 years or so. I had the privilege to work with most of the Fortune 100 companies and help them with their journey to have their management system certified. As I said, to a variety of ISO standards, in particular in quality as well as in information security. Back to Fran.
Thank you, Willie. So we're going to kick off the webinar with our first poll today. So what best describes your organization's position in the supply chain? Are you primary manufacturer, tier 1 supplier, tier 2 supplier, other, or I don't know? Just to gauge a bit of an idea of who we have listening today. I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that. And remember, while you're doing, please feel free to put any questions you have in the control panel and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. So do we have the results for those now? Lovely. So we've got 13% for prime, 50% for tier 1 supplier, 25% for tier 2 supplier, 13% for other, and luckily nobody hits the I don't know category, so that's excellent. So welcome everyone this morning, and we will now move back on and over to our carry on our webinar.
Okay, thanks, Fran. On the screen in front of you, you can see the top 10 risks in the aerospace sector. It's a very broad list, of course, but we can't cover all of them in this webinar. So we're going to focus on a few. So if you can just click on, please. So the ones we're going to really focus on are managing the supply chain, compliance with regulations, innovation, and cybersecurity. So if we think about the supply chain, for example, the primes and tier ones, generally speaking, have strong and robust systems. But the further down the supply chain one goes, the less rigor is applied or even understanding of the risks. And there is, dare I say, a degree of ignorance and naivety, coupled with a focus perhaps on cost of prevention rather than understanding the cost of being compromised. So a short-term view rather than a long-term view. So the deeper one goes down the supply chain, the less visibility there is for the primes. And less visibility, of course, equals risk. And it's interesting that Stacey Bosniak of the CMMC recently said at an event that a lot of people don't understand what the requirements are. They just say, yes, I comply, so they can win the business. And then with the compliance of regulations, the compliance landscape is rather fragmented. And there are different requirements from different organizations, different regulators around the world, and different elements of the industry. And it is fragmented, and they can't even agree yet on terminology. So there isn't an agreed suite of terms. So you might find information security, cyber security, information system resilience, and so on. So there's an issue there, but there's also tempo. Technology is advancing. We've got electronic flight bags and in-flight entertainment and live streaming, constantly advancing technology. And of course, next we've got autonomy and AI and personal mobility. And regulation tends to be slow, so it struggles to keep up. The tempo of technology is faster than the tempo of regulation. And this links, of course, to the capacity to innovate. Tech companies are innovating all the time with new concepts, new tools. Engineers and designers like the new machines and things that go being, so they're trying to bring in new technology and potentially are hampered by or compromised by the regulation. And of course, as we bring on technology, perhaps without the umbrella of regulation, it means that we're exposed to cybersecurity events. Just because the good guys are coming up with new ideas, so too the bad actors are looking at ways of compromising them, stealing IP, stealing personal data, compromising systems. A simple thing like an electronic flight bag, if you have a mobile one, for example, I trust all your USB ports are blanked off. So there are risks there. And then we think about the live data streaming. Aircraft are constantly live streaming performance data. And then a Pentagon report says, assume all satellites are hacked. So all of these things linked together present a risk background, a risk profile for us to deal with.
Thanks, Brendan. And I think it's unarguable that we're seeing a huge period of transformation across the aerospace sector, and it's probably the greatest period of transformation since the formation of the sector at the start of the 20th century. We're seeing an evolution, as you mentioned, towards electric aircraft and autonomous aircraft and the advent of drones, and we're probably moving very rapidly towards an era of true digital aviation. But what does that mean in terms of the core aspects of the sector? Well, we're seeing four key megatrends. That is the turning of maintenance data and the monetization of that data for revenue and profit. The continuing need for safety to advance in the world of digital aviation. The new world of electrical propulsion, which will open a new era. But also those trusted partnerships. What is the supply chain? What is the need for collaboration? And if we look at all these four megatrends, it's undoubted that effective cybersecurity will be not an inhibitor, but a strategic enabler to all four of these business aims. And if we get it right, then the sector will engender that customer trust. If we get it wrong, it will undermine that consumer trust and inhibit the realization of these strategic goals. But Brendan, looking at maybe the topic of intellectual property first of all, How do you see, the threat from cybersecurity as we look at these 4 mega trends of intellectual property, and how is this going to impact the sector?
Yeah, there are plenty of examples of IP being stolen, and the stealing of IP may be focused on a particular area, a particular element of the aerospace sector. So we have commercial operations, we have MRO, and we have elements like defence, of course. So there are different motivations behind those, and there are plenty of examples of defence intellectual property being stolen. I won't cite any particular examples for obvious reasons, but there are plenty of examples of that being stolen. And it usually happens further down the supply chain. I mentioned the supply chain risks earlier on. And the issue perhaps is an element of management and the culture in these lower tier organizations. If the management is, as I mentioned earlier on, perhaps naive, and I dare say complacent, and to quote that Stacey Bosniak statement, they just want to win the business without understanding the risks, then couple that with a lack of visibility down the supply chain and you have a risk which needs to be managed. So the primes need to collaborate far more with their supply chain so they really understand and help the supply chains understand what the risks are and manage them and flow down requirements, specific requirements to help them and support them in managing and addressing those risks.
And that's a great point, Brendan. And Willie, you and I, we see this as a key issue that many information security and cybersecurity professionals have been trying to look at for years. What are you seeing across this sector and indeed other sectors? Because it can't be just retained within the aerospace sector. What are you seeing as the steps that organisations are taking, and as they look to evidence trust with their partners and all levels of the supply chain?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, because yes, you are right. It's not limited to the aerospace sector. It's really a universal challenge, not to say a problem. And I think it comes down to analyzing what is the word trust actually meaning. Among others, it means transparency, or like Brandon said earlier, visibility. And when I was auditing organizations in the Washington, D.C. area on a regular basis, I told them, look, guys, you are really not of interest to the bad actors, but you are the conduit to the interesting target. So in other words, the supply chain is really the risk area where bad actors have a relatively simple entrance point or entry point. And I'm coming from the management system domain, so I really would like to emphasize the importance of ISO 27001, the information security management system, as well as ISO 28000, supply chain security. And both management system standards are excellent governance structures, or provide governance structures to organizations throughout the supply chain. And at the end of the day, it's this typical example where a small little 2-person company has a security risk, and the rest is history, right? In recent days, we have heard about the hack of a gas line pipeline within the United States, shutting down about 30% of the gas delivery to the East Coast. That's critical infrastructure hacked, and the same can happen with aerospace. Back to you,
It's a great,
Mark.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Willie. And indeed, the aerospace sector is directly impacted by that colonial breach, because it also supplies aviation fuel to many of the core aviation hubs across the East Coast. So it'll be interesting to see how long this incident sustains, and the impact on the economy moving forward. Taking the next step, Fran, we've got another poll question.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. So on to poll number 2. What is the primary driver for security and cyber risk management in your organisation? Please select one out of legal and regulatory obligations, contractual obligations, operational and/or safety, reputational and/or financial, or I don't know, stroke any other. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds to do that. And just to let you know that you will be sent the webinar recording in due course, so you'll have a copy to play anything back as well. Lovely. So have we got those results coming in now? Fantastic, thank you. So that's 33% for legal and regulatory obligations, 22% for contractual obligations, 22% as well for operational and/or safety, and 22% again for reputational and/or financial, and nothing in the I don't know category. So that's a really even split there. Thank you very much for entering into that, and back over to you, Mark, to continue the presentation.
And thanks, Fran, and thanks everyone for responding to these poll questions. It gives us great insight. Brendan, we touched on earlier the fact that IP theft is systemic across the sector, and it's one of the core problems that the sector faces. And undoubtedly, history tells us that trade secrets worth billions have been lost to foreign countries. What are we seeing as the reason for this? What are the key drivers that are making IP theft so systemic a problem within aerospace?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Willie touched on it earlier on about where the bad actors focus, because they know where the vulnerabilities are. The primes tend to have robust systems. The further you go down the supply chain, the weaker those systems are. And there's a degree of complacency, naivety, and so on. The motivation for stealing information are broad, or the motivations are broad. You can see examples on the screen now, examples of where systems, information, technical information, even battle plans, dare I say, have been targets of hackers. But any piece of information is vulnerable. If you think about your personnel, protecting the personnel data, if your personnel don't have their data protected, then they will feel vulnerable. So your business could be compromised by human factors impacting on your staff. Nobody wants to think their personal data has been stolen. And naivety comes into this. I'll give you a simple example, which is not to do with aerospace, but it's a good example. I'm going to an event this weekend, and because of COVID, the organisers want everybody to send in a whole load of information online, and it asks for pretty much everything you need to steal my identity, open bank accounts in my name, and so on. And I was the only one that refused to do it and questioned it. So the biggest weakness perhaps in any system is the people, which brings us back to the culture of the people, the training and awareness that people have. And that, of course, in turn comes from culture and leadership. So all the standards that Willie referred to talk extensively about understanding the context, understanding the risks, defining a strategy, and then communicating and implementing that strategy. So the leadership element is really key here.
And are there any areas where, in your experience, Brendan, you're seeing leadership not actually being demonstrated, or people not acting on what is actually quite evident, weaknesses in corporate approaches? Why is it not being fixed?
It's a good question. I went to an event a couple of years ago, which was an aerospace event run by a prime, and they got their supply chain in the UK together to talk about this very topic, cybersecurity. And I think it's fair to say that they were shocked when they realised that most of their supply chain had no form of documented cybersecurity protocols or anything to show them to say that their systems were secure. Things like Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, which are really pretty basic. A lot of them didn't even have that or weren't aware of it. So it really comes back to a degree to that naivety. Now, primes flow down requirements in their contractual documentations, and you can go online and look at a lot of the information that they flow down. And if you look at some of the quality management standards, if I cite AS9100, it's got a clause that says, in simple terms, digital data must be protected. And that's all it says. And that should lead on to specific requirements. So I think the system will be much more robust if the primes were to flow down precise requirements for what they expect an organization to do, as in referring to standards, because this leads to a robust implementation and a system of third-party verification that those systems are indeed effective. No system, of course, is going to be 100% proof, but if you've got a management system in place, you're much better protected than you would be without it. So again, I think it comes down to naivety and perhaps too much trust. Maybe they trust people down the supply chain to do the right thing. But again, I refer back to that quote from CMMC, where people in the lower supply chains just don't understand the requirements and just say that they comply to win the business. So culture, leadership, flow down, verification of implementation, there's a raft of things in there that could be done.
And Willie, looking at some of those aspects, and both yourself and Brendan have talked about naivety, and to me, and across my experience, there are a lot of misconceptions about IP theft, and I'd like to spend the next few minutes really sort of discussing with you both what our experiences combined sort of really tell us about the misconceptions that many organizations have, but then switching fire and looking at some of the very simple responses that organizations can put in place, and maybe from those listed, what are the one or two top misconceptions that you see when speaking to customers around IP theft and why it's happening?
Yeah, I don't know if it is just naivety or if it is naivety combined with ignorance and a lack of awareness. And I think that all three are actually an indicator or one of the possible reasons for the issues we see. A lot of organizations have the misconception that it's all about an IT system. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm coming from the IT world. As a 16-year-old boy, I was playing around with microchips and programmed them in assembler. But IT is only one component. We shall not forget the human component. And when I'm looking here at the screen and I see something like IT administrators are the biggest threat. Nope, they aren't. It's the casual user that is sitting at his or her laptop and receiving an email from Uncle Joe saying that there is a very important spreadsheet attached. They request it and they click on the spreadsheet, and the next thing they know, the laptop is infected. And when I'm also looking here at IP theft is only conducted by a single person. Wrong. It's this kind of stuff is done by sophisticated groups that make it a living, that make it a business to steal valuable information. And from my point of view, IP is definitely very important. But what is IP? Is it a drawing? Is it the technical specification of a bolt or a nut or a landing gear? No, intellectual property can be anything and everything, right? It could be business plans, it could be staffing plans, it could be all kinds of proprietary confidential information. And I think that at the end of the day, we need to ensure that we have an adequate mix of technical and organizational controls and procedures in place to ensure that we have trained the people with regard to awareness, that we do understand what are the requirements coming from the contracts, not just saying, yeah, do it. And we need to have the technical level in terms of using analytics and using the latest technologies available, whether this is machine learning or AI as appropriate. That's a different story. But we need to be constantly adapting to the environment, and we need to be agile.
I think you raised some great points there, Willie, and I think in my experience as well, we shouldn't forget that this often goes down as normal business activity. I recall an incident about 10 years ago when I was the global CISO at SAP Miller, and we were putting some new monitoring solutions into place and really checking to see what was going on in the area of IP theft. And we were able to identify that one of our main competitors was trying to not steal IP, but to massively recruit against our company. And they weren't actually even doing it through external emails. The communications were taking place through our corporate email system. So very brazen and very open approach. And I think, for me, this is where a lot of organizations don't really recognize what's ongoing. They don't think about the employee awareness. They don't think about the monitoring. They don't think about both the physical and digital behaviors. And there is a need to not just set things up at the outset, but to periodically and regularly review and attest the access controls. Think about who has access to what data, why do they need access, and to not just monitor, but to think about, well, sometimes you have to stop user activity taking place. But you need to think about the business impact when you're doing it. And all too often, unfortunately, in the security technology space, a lot of solutions are sold as silver bullets, that one-stop shop to preventing all ills in cybersecurity. I think you and I would heartily agree, Willie, that there is no such thing as that silver bullet to solve the issue of cybersecurity risk. And that's ever more prevalent.
Sorry, Mark, there's one other point.
Of course, Brendan. Yeah.
An example I'd just like to bring in where Willie mentioned the people factor. 2 or 3 years ago, there was an example of some engineers writing or developing code for a prime, in fact, for an airliner. And because they wanted to collaborate, working inside the company's systems made life difficult. So they put the code onto an external insecure server, where it was found by an ethical hacker. And he brought it up at one of these hacking conferences and showed that all this software for an airliner for various systems was being stored outside the prime's secure system, simply because a human factor, the people working on it, decided to make life a little easier for themselves and work outside the perimeter.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think what you described there, Brendan, really sort of starts to amplify what's happening in the aerospace sector as we transform into this post-pandemic recovery. As one of the few constants will be an ever-increasing connectivity transformation. Right? And this is all being designed through new technology to aid aerospace operations. But Willie, if I look at this picture, and this is a simple version of the ecosystem, what do you see as the key technology risks and challenges from this increased technological complexity and connectivity?
Well, you used the word already, complexity and depth of connectivity, right? I mean, when you look at, I come from a passenger perspective, so I'm checking in, right, and have my bookings. Obviously, everything is on my iPhone, and the moment I'm entering the airport, well, the airline knows already I'm there because, well, geolocations, right? And who says that my cell phone is not compromised to a degree that it may have an impact upon the airline's system? And then who says that the airline's system has not an impact on the flight control system that is governing the safety of the planes taking off? So the thing is really the connectivity of all those systems. And I think that with a concept like zero trust, we all have heard about that's a wonderful example of, yes, we need to be connected, no question about that, because otherwise modern world is not going to work any longer, right? But at the same token, at the same time, we really need to make sure that we only accept incoming traffic from known sources at a particular moment in time with a particular kind of information. And this picture for me, on one hand, is mind-boggling, but at the same time, it's not even touching the real connectivity, because that's the famous tip of the iceberg kind of thing. And there are many, many more connections that are there. And I think at the end of the day, it's really about trust throughout the supply chain. And that means every player in this ecosystem needs to do their fair share of ensuring that their respective systems are secure, but at the same time ensuring that their business partners, and I intentionally use that word versus suppliers, that their business partners are safe as well. Back to you, Mark.
And Brendan, looking specifically at individual airframes, the picture doesn't really get much simpler. So what are the risks here?
Thanks, Mark. Well, there's a good example that goes back a couple of years to a 757, which we know is an older airframe, but just to see whether systems could be hacked, the US Homeland Defense decided to give it a go, and they were able to hack a 757 remotely, which is quite interesting. So as we go forward with more modern aircraft and more connectivity in the system, then, as we mentioned earlier on, if you had new technology with regulation perhaps lagging, unable to keep up with tempo, you have the human factors coming into that, and you have greater connectivity opening up new vulnerabilities. If we think about a simple thing like an electronic flight bag, that is the route that leads to electronic technical logs, that links to the constant live streaming of airframe and engine performance data via satellite down to ground stations and to the engine OEMs and so on. So all these things are linked together, and if any one of those is compromised, then it presents quite significant risk potential. And it depends how the bad actors might choose to engage with that. There are engine management systems, FADEC, for example, full authority digital engine control systems. There's fly-by-wire systems, and more aircraft are moving to totally electronic flight systems because it saves a lot of weight. If we think about the A320neo, for example, they're going for a fully electronic rudder, whereas previously it had mechanical links, and that saves 40 kilos, which is a good saving to have. But if you have electronic systems, then if some bad actor were able to get into those by some means, then it could compromise the system. And I don't think it's not just about installed systems. You've got to go right back down through the supply chain for the components that go into that system, and indeed the code. The AS9100 standard, for example, talks about counterfeits and unapproved parts. Now, I think when that was written, it was thinking about ailerons and valve blocks and this sort of stuff. But there's no reason why that shouldn't equally apply to code, unapproved code. Where did your code get written? Who wrote the code? Who provided the firmware? So unapproved parts goes beyond just the physical. So the connectivity, the regulation opens up new risk potential.
And just looking, you touched on code, and obviously they're having a couple of major instances of software failures in recent years. The cyber threat isn't just about the hacking community. It's the confidence over the delivery of the modern software. And what are some of the responses that we've seen across the sector over the past maybe 12 to 18 months to that challenge, where they've actually had some downtime to think about the lessons learned of software failure and the need for better software delivery assurance going forward?
It's an interesting link between the software, the public perception, and the regulatory side of things. So I think these need to be looked at holistically, because the event that we're talking about have led to the regulators to reflect, as well as the manufacturers, and the flying public has certainly been reflecting on these things. So it's in the public purview now. It's in the mind of the travelling public, and of course, with the post-pandemic circumstance and trying to get people back onto aircraft, confidence in aviation is critical. We've been focused on, obviously, contamination protection, but confidence in the aircraft as well is important. So the link again comes back to the concept of risk, the management of risk, the DFMEA, if you like, design failure mode and effect analysis in the electronics, in the firmware, in the software, and how the regulators are able to deal with that, because the tempo of development is such that regulators have been unable to keep up, and indeed have been perhaps allowing the primes to self-regulate to an extent. So it's changed the whole thought process behind regulation.
Thanks for those insights, Brendan and Willie. Fran, this brings us to our third poll.
Thanks, Mark. So poll number 3, do you use management system standards and certification to manage suppliers and risks? Please select 1, required for all suppliers, required of some suppliers, no but you plan to in the next 6 months, no but you plan to in the next 18 months, or not currently planned, stroke I don't know. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds to answer that, and just remind you again to post any questions that you have for us in the control panel. And as I mentioned earlier, a recording will be available of this webinar in due course. So if I can see the results there. Lovely, thank you. So it's 18% required for all suppliers, 73% required of some suppliers, 9% no but plan to in the next 6 months, none for the next 18 months, or none currently planned, stroke I don't know. So that's really interesting feedback. Thank you very much for participating in that poll, and I'll now pass back over to Mark to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Fran, and again, thanks to everyone attending for their insights on these poll questions. Brendan, you touched on previously that the regulatory perspective is changing, and security and compliance are often synonymous with the same topic, but in many areas are different. But we are seeing that there is an increasing complexity of regulatory compliance. How can this be achieved, or indeed eased, through leveraging the management systems? When you look at the raft, which is only a small subsection of some of the evolving security guidelines that we have on the slide here.
Thanks, Mark. There's a couple of things here. One is the regulators themselves. There's a plethora of regulations, and of course there are different regulations applied to different aspects of the aerospace ecosystem, if you like, whether it's to air traffic control, whether it's to ground-based systems, maintenance systems, flight systems. But perhaps they shouldn't be looked at in isolation, because it is an ecosystem, it's an organism, and there's connectivity between all of them. We've seen all the diagrams where all of these systems are linked. And so the regulators have a part to play, and it's perhaps reassuring or gratifying to be aware that the FAA and EASA, for example, are starting to work together on collaboration. They had a seminar in September last year, for example, where they're starting to talk together about cybersecurity policy updates for connected aircraft systems, because they recognize that there is this divergence or disparity or lack of integration. Aerospace is a global system, a global industry, and there needs to be collaboration at the regulatory level. When we get down to the level of standards, there are the regulatory requirements, and some examples of which are on the screen there. But we mentioned earlier about leadership and management and naivety, and people not understanding perhaps what they need to do. And when they have requirements flowed down from a prime or from a regulator, they perhaps don't understand what those are or don't know how to manage those. So there's a couple of things here. Some of the standards that Willie mentioned, the 27001 and 28001, can help you bring together a system to manage and govern all these things. And there is another standard, it's a fairly recent one actually, which BSI has brought out, BS 22000, and that's 202000, which is a standard for management of standards, to put it simply. So it's to help organizations to understand how they need to manage all these various standards and regulations in a coordinated way so that they can actually meet them. So my suggestion or advice to everybody listening to this would be to look at that and see how it can help bring together all these disparate things and help you manage all the things with which you have to comply. So there's two elements: the regulators working together and industry understanding the requirements at all levels and really managing it effectively and providing assurance ultimately to the travelling public.
Thanks, Brendan. And Willie, turning specifically to the identification and response within organisations to cybersecurity and privacy risks, what maybe picking up on a few of these shown on the slide, what are the key steps that you would advise organisations on?
Start with the first thing. Consider security and privacy by design. Information security or security of systems seems to be always an afterthought. It's not necessarily displayed in the design phase, which is mind-boggling. Before COVID hit, I was traveling something like 150,000 miles a year with 100-something plus flights. And therefore, I had obviously the privilege to see a couple of interesting things. Why on earth would you have an entertainment system in the passenger seat that is displaying the Linux kernel it's running on and all the lists of modules that it's loading? It's not exactly clear to me why would that be being displayed to the passenger. And by the way, when we are talking about privacy, privacy by design, why would these entertainment systems have a camera built in? Just because it's technically possible doesn't mean it should be done. And that has something to do with continually enhancing your staff awareness, because I know how it happens. These engineers responsible for selecting the entertainment system said, "Oh, there's a camera. Wonderful. Let's use it. I love cameras," right? And the next thing we know, it's in the passenger seat. Why? Just because it's from a technical point of view possible doesn't mean it should be done. And then I really would like to emphasize that everybody needs to do some horizon scanning, right? So trying to understand what are the latest trends, what are the latest threats and risks, so that we can take the appropriate actions. And it comes down to collaboration throughout the supply chain. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, and I think the one that I would really highlight is, it's an old adage from a previous CEO of mine, which is fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And for many organizations, they often, will look at risk management and say, well, thank God that happened to somebody else, or don't worry, that won't happen to us. And unfortunately, those are the organizations who, when they don't look at that incident management, they don't look at that business disruption, they're the ones that really struggle to recover. So, preparation for that time of need, that urgency, is, in my mind, a key step that many organizations miss. And really at BSI, the key is that we look to drive best practice to help organizations mature in a raft of areas. And the collection of those, the collective, is around operational resilience, organizational resilience. And for us, that falls into three key areas: the operational resilience, the supply chain resilience, and the information resilience. And Willie, you touched on horizon scanning is probably one of the key areas that you would look at. Brendan, from your perspective, in aerospace, what's probably the one area that you would say that the aerospace sector really has to double down on as a core capability in the next few months and years to really sort of build that confidence back up?
I think it always comes back to the supply chain. Information, we've got the three domains here: information resilience, supply chain resilience, operational resilience. They really are linked as well. Each needs the other. And for a supply chain to be resilient, every element in that supply chain needs to have a good understanding of the threats and the risks, not just to threat of IP, but also to the deliverables. They might be delivering software as well, of course. So really understanding the risks pertinent to them, really understanding the flow down requirements, of really having good governance and management systems in place to address all those. So using a structured approach based on knowledge and being really informed and aware, and getting over that previously mentioned ignorance, naivety that has been prevalent in the past. And that comes down to leadership and to people.
And from my own sort of personal view and experience, I would say testing is going to be key. You know, is the supply chain secure? Test it. If you don't have the evidence, you can't prove it. Is the software trustworthy? If you don't test it, you're not going to know. So the testing regime, you're testing the supply chain, testing the software, testing the digital design, testing the need for technology enablement, as Willie mentioned. Just because it's capable doesn't mean it needs to be fulfilled. So testing for me is going to be one of the core areas that organizations really need to look at to embolden that confidence. Fran, that brings us to the end of the panelist discussion. So I'll hand it back over to you, and hopefully we've got some questions that have been asked by the audience.
We do indeed. Thank you very much, Mark. So yes, moving on to the Q&A section. The first question that's come in, of the top 10 risks, which do you think is the most challenging or easiest to address? So I'll leave that open to our speakers, whoever feels they want to jump in and answer that one.
I take that one. I would say the easiest and most complicated one is the supply chain, managing the supply chain. So it's on one hand it's the easiest because it's so obvious, right? We all have suppliers, but then when we look at the earlier poll, if I'm not mistaken, 75 or 78% of the respondents said something like some of the suppliers are subject to supply chain assessments. Why only some? Why not all suppliers? And I know the answer. The answer is we have literally thousands of suppliers. Do you really expect that we do that for thousands of suppliers? Actually, yes, I do, because the biggest risk is not your biggest supplier. The biggest risk is actually the smaller supplier that delivers only this one single component that just happens to be having also source code, which happens to be, you know, compromised. And I think the easiest and most complicated thing that every organization really needs to address is security in the supply chain. Brandon, any thoughts on that?
I would agree, Willie. The security in the supply chain is the thing which, in my discussions with industry, with the primes and so on, that is the big risk. The primes have robust systems. The further you go down the supply chain, the less robust it is, and it is not an easy fix, but it is the most critical fix. And the way to do that is, you mentioned the supply chain auditing and so on, but it's really thinking about what you flow down to them. Saying, I want you to protect digital data, a lot of them won't know where to start or how to start. But if you use standards that are out there, they're out there for a reason, to give structure. If you reference standards in your flow down, they are verifiable. They can be independently checked by third parties, which in turn gives you, as the prime or the tier one or wherever you are in the supply chain, a level of confidence that you perhaps wouldn't otherwise have. So if you can't go down and audit all those suppliers yourself, if they have third-party verified systems, you've got a level of confidence. So use the system.
Yeah, and I think Brendan, you and I, will share past history of seeing DEFCON flow downs in contracts, and it was very easy because you knew exactly what the requirements were, and I would both align with Brendan and Willie that the supply chain is the area that has to be tackled, but I also support Willie. It's also very difficult, and one of the other reasons for it being so difficult is that trust aspect. Just because a vendor says they're secure, are they secure? Have you considered the right to audit, how are you verifying and validating their responses is going to be key. But maybe as you're looking at the other risks and looking at areas which I think are going to be equally as difficult or challenging for organizations is the capacity to innovate. And certainly as we look at the advent of further emerging technologies with smart cities, with 5G, the aviation industry is going to look to innovate at a very rapid pace. And I just wonder whether it's set up as an organizational structure to be able to move that quickly, and what will move quicker, the technology or the pace at which the sector is able to respond.
I think an interesting point there, Mark, is that as technology changes, we're getting non-aerospace people coming into the aerospace sector. I'll give you a simple example. I was at an event, a show in Excel in London 2-3 years ago. It was an MRO event primarily, but there were quite a few companies there touting their in-flight entertainment systems. And every one of them, as I went around, I asked them about if you've got live streaming on your aircraft and everybody in the aircraft is connecting their tablet, their phone, whatever it is, into that system so that they can engage in the entertainment, get onto the internet and so on. What security protocols do you have in place to make sure that one of the passengers isn't on the aircraft harvesting everybody's information? How do you know that the personal data of those individuals is not being sought, or that somebody is not using that system to try and get into other systems? What protocols have you had in place? And without exception, they looked at me blankly because they hadn't thought of it, because they weren't aerospace people. They weren't thinking of an airplane as this massive, great metal tube with a couple of heaters on, but a lot of integrated systems. They didn't have that mindset.
That's great. Thanks, Brendan. I'll now move on to the next question. I've got a couple of questions around the standards. So one around 27,000 and asking for a bit more information around that, and the other one about 28,000. Because they're sort of saying, oh, they heard it for the first time, and they're asking if they can have a bit more information around it, about the supplier risk management side of it. So, Willie, would that be one for yourself?
I guess that falls into my domain. Yeah, so 27001 is a management system for the protection of information. So information security management system. And it starts with a very simple question like, who are we? What are we doing? So context of the organization. That's very crucial that everybody, that the organization really defines who we are, what they do. So to Brandon's point, are we an entertainment company producing, some kind of infrastructure so that people can connect to us? Or are we a company in the aerospace industry that is designing this kind of systems? And that's a very crucial component, because that means we really need to understand the regulations, the requirements, the ecosystem around us. And then obviously it goes into the risk assessment and identifying suitable controls to counter those risks, mitigate those risks. And then the organization needs to implement these controls and repeat the whole process with regard to internal audits, corrective actions. ISO 28000, the other standard we mentioned earlier, is related to supply chain security. And it's a very generic standard that helps organizations to really understand the security implications throughout the supply chain. And information security is obviously one of those components, but there's also supply chain disruptions, whether this is caused by the blockage of the Suez Canal, or whether this is supply chain issues related to issues in the semiconductor industry right now with capacity issues producing the silicon, or whether this is even kidnapping and other threats throughout the supply chain. So if an organization is really interested in beefing up the security of their supply chain and reliability of the supply chain, the ISO 28000 is definitely a very interesting standard. And interesting enough, we have seen a great increase in interest in that standard just beginning Q4 last year, continuing into Q1 this year, from organizations in the hemisphere of the DoD here in the United States.
Maybe a quick point to add on that, Willie, as well, is and having speaking as an industry practitioner as well, the key I always find to standards is the scoping at the outset. Many organizations look at standards and hope that it will be a panacea to a problem statement. And the key is actually understanding the relevance and the required scope of a standard and how it fits your organization. And you mentioned those points, that it's key to ensure that what you do within the standard actually will help deliver. I would flip that on its head and say that is a word of caution that I would also give to organizations who rely on questionnaires to validate some of their concerns or risks around the supply chain. When you're looking at responses from organizations, and they may say, well, yes, we're secure because we have an ISO 27000 certificate. The very next question to ask should be, I want to see the statement of applicability of that 27,000 certificate or that 28,000 certificate, because it may not even be relevant to the services that are provided. So scope of a management system certification is an absolute element to understand, both from an internal benefit perspective, but also from an evidence perspective when looking at the responses from suppliers.
It's funny that you say that, Mark, because in one of my audits many years ago, I reviewed a certificate one of our customers received from one of their suppliers, and it literally said something like the distribution of high strength fasteners or something like that. Well, that's fine. It's the distribution, right? It's not talking about the manufacturing. It's not talking about the design. So on a regular basis, companies are getting certificates from their suppliers and not reviewing what the actual scope is. So, Mark, you hit the nail on the head, so to speak.
It's a very good point, and in the AS9100 series, and indeed ISO 9001, there's a lot in there about the criteria for supplier approval. And when I've been visiting companies or auditing companies in the past, that's often an interesting area to look at. And you ask them, well, what are your criteria for supplier approval? And quite often they have one. Again, they don't understand the question really, so they might just say, well, we require them to have ISO 9001, for example. So you then, well, in what way is that pertinent to what they're providing to you? So if they're providing software, then is ISO 9001 all that you need? And if it is ISO 9001, what is their scope of certification? So it's quite common in criteria for approval to cite a certificate or a couple of certificates or a standard or something, but they very rarely mention the scope, to pick up on Mark's point, which is absolutely correct. And they don't really understand what they're actually asking for. They put, I hate to say it, but sometimes they put something in there for the sake of putting something in there without really understanding what they're doing. So defining properly your criteria for supplier approval and then making sure that they meet it is a good part of that supply chain management.
And Fran, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I think what's evident from the discussion today is that the aerospace sector is one that recognizes it has gaps in its overall maturity. It's one that it's on a journey, not just metaphorically, but very realistically in the cybersecurity maturity, and the overall risk management posture is one that, as a sector, recognise needs to benefit. Unfortunately, we could have talked much longer, but I'll hand it back over to you to close this webinar.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And just to let everybody know, for those that if we've not managed to get around to your question, we will take that offline and make sure we do come back to you with a response. So just onto a final poll. This is just for us to get a bit of an idea if you'd like any information from us. Would you like us to contact you via an email or phone call about any of the following: product and system certification, standards, training, consulting, or are you simply listening in to get some more information today? So we're not going to display those results, but that's just for us to get a bit of an idea if there's anything that you need off the back of the webinar. So thanks very much. I would like to thank Brendan, Mark and Willie for a great presentation today, and you, the audience, for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. And finally, please do leave your feedback in the survey, which we will run at the end of the webinar. Now, I know if we just move on to the next slide, I've just got some contact details before we finally go. If we can just revert back to that quick. I think we might be having a few technical issues with that, but if we can't pull that slide up, what we'll do is we'll make sure in the follow-up that you've got Brendan, Mark and Willie's email information as well. So if you have if there's any further queries, if you want to get into discussion about anything, then please do reach out to one of those contacts. So, and we also have a white paper which will be available in due course following the webinar as well. So we will make that publicly available, and that will cover a lot of the information today. So thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye.